Hi everyone, Nick here from SwitchJoy. I just wanted to quickly mention at the top of this review that I apologize in advance for the framerate issues in the video. This is 100% due to my gameplay capture setup and is not indicative of the game's performance. I plan on fixing these issues in future videos. With that, let's get to the review.
Getting in touch for any particular reason? Like, say, to congratulate me?
Is he there? Any sign of Porygon?
Only his minions, so far.
While there's no shortage of 2D platformers on Switch, and we've reviewed plenty of them here at SwitchJoy, not all of them are created equally. Trollhunters Defenders of Arcadia, from developer WayForward and publisher Outright Games, takes the critically successful Netflix original series from DreamWorks and Guillermo del Toro and tacks the IP onto a 2.5D action platformer. The result is one that, while its characters and presentation do justice to the source material, simply falls short on its own merit even as a run-of-the-mill action platforming experience. The Netflix original series, Trollhunters Tales of Arcadia, burst onto the streaming platform in 2016 to critical acclaim. Now, 2 years after the show set off into the sunset, WayForward and Outright Games have sought to bring the series to life in its first video game adaptation. The story-heavy animated series brought to Switch loses some of its narrative focus in that endeavor. There is a story here that I won't spoil for fans of the series, but I will say that time traveling is a central mechanic both to the story as well as a means for players to get from one level to another, or to backtrack to earlier levels if needed. As an outsider who has very limited familiarity with the Netflix series, I can't say the narrative made any great strides to capture my attention. That said, the story does follow main series protagonist Jim Lake Jr. along with his friends Toby and Claire, alongside other familiar faces from the Netflix series. Fans of the Tales of Arcadia series will surely find story threads in Defenders of Arcadia that pull through from the Netflix series, but on its own the story did little to carry much weight in my eyes, though this is clearly a game aimed at children, or teens or adults who may be familiar with the franchise. That said, all dialogue is fully voiced, seemingly by the original voice actors, so fans of the franchise should find plenty to appreciate in that regard.
The time map took me to the geode caverns below Troll Market.
Ooh, that's where we first met Myrtle!
The execution of actual gameplay, however, is where Defenders of Arcadia unfortunately fall short. Platformers should typically ensure that, well, platforming feels tight and fine-tuned, and unfortunately that's not the case with Defenders of Arcadia. While the mechanics of jumping and movement feel just fine, I never felt like I had pixel-perfect control as I do in, say, a Mario or even a Trine title. That minor complaint aside, the platforming feels just fine. Other mechanics are introduced as the game progresses, such as sliding, dashing, and shield gliding, which add a nice bit of variety to just the jump and slash combo that became a rote activity. Combat, on the other hand, is about as one-note as it can be. You get a sword, and that's kind of it. You do unlock a Sword of Throwing Star early on, but it does so little damage it's hardly worth using but on the weakest of enemies. Otherwise, you're relegated to your trusty blade with the same 3-hit combo for everything. And I mean everything. The swoosh sound of the blade is still ingrained in my mind. You do also unlock certain assist abilities throughout the game, such as Toby using his trusted hammer to clear red blocks, or Anger Rot summoning a stone platform which helps you reach higher areas. But the space between unlocking them is so great that you don't even unlock some of the most useful abilities until the game is near its end. As for enemies, most die in 2 to 5 strikes, with a few exceptions. And aside from bosses, none of the game's enemies pose much of a threat, especially when you can dispatch them with a combo or two. Really, it seems that enemies are simply fodder so that the platforming itself doesn't seem like too much a breeze, which, with very few exceptions, it usually is. Which brings us to the level design. For the most part, each level is fairly linear, with a few hidden pockets that contain collectible socks or gnomes that you can use for consumables or for use in minigames, respectively. With the rare exception of levels that force vertical or horizontal movement with threat of death, the game's level design is pretty standard fare. Horizontal-based levels with some disappearing or moving platforms, some spike traps to avoid, and the frequent enemy fodder to keep things somewhat interesting. One of my major nitpicks with the game is how it handles damage from enemies and stage hazards, or rather the inconsistency between the two. Most enemies take a quarter of a heart when your character is hit, and if your hearts are depleted, you're returned to the most recent unmarked checkpoint. If, however, you hit a stage hazard, such as spikes, rather than taking damage and giving you a second or two of invulnerability to escape, like in many other platformers, you simply die and return to the last checkpoint. You don't lose a life when this happens, but it was often frustrating to lose a substantial amount of level progress just because my character didn't land where I directed them. That said, while the actual level design is mostly boring, the stylization of the levels and backdrop for each group of levels is absolutely gorgeous. It's clear the Netflix series influenced the game design, if assets from the show weren't directly used or recreated here. And for that I must hand it to the art team. They really did an outstanding job, which is a shame that the wrappings are better than the package itself. Along those lines, the music for each level is handled to great effect. Some of the music is reused between levels within the same group or theme, but that didn't present much of an issue for me. One more thing to point out. You may notice that the gameplay in this video is from some of the game's early levels, and some of the things I mentioned in this review haven't been shown. That's because, in a bewildering turn of events, all of my progress was erased after completing the game, and it was by design. At the end of the game, you're asked, within the context of the story, if you'd like to keep playing previous levels or if you want to be sent back to the beginning of the game, and I quote, as if nothing ever happened. I chose the latter option, thinking there was some post-game content or maybe some kind of New Game Plus mode that awaited me. Not the case. I was returned to the opening cinematic with all of my collected items, abilities, and currency completely reset. I planned to go back through and 100% the game to find all the collectibles and capture gameplay for this review, but I simply can't bring myself to play through the game for another 10 or so hours to regain all of my lost progress. To be fair, the game did ask if I was sure I wanted to return to the beginning, but I was given no indication that meant all of my progress would be reset, which is a shame. So, at the time of this review, there is no way to officially complete the game without losing all of your progress, which is an odd move to make on the developer's part. Why not just let me choose New Game at the title screen if I wanted to start a new game and overwrite my progress? Why build that into the story of the game? I don't have an answer, but I think it's important to highlight for players as they reach this point in the game. As a bookend, I can't end this review without noting the absolutely abysmal load times on Switch. The load times between levels rivals loading a save from the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim on Switch. Sure, it's a game from 2011 running on less than ideal hardware, but Skyrim is a massive game compared to Defenders of Arcadia. It's just something to be mindful of. While, in terms of art direction and overall presentation, it adequately lives up to the Netflix original series it's based upon, the same can't be said of the gameplay and overall feel of Trollhunters Defenders of Arcadia. With far too simplistic combat, stale level design, inconsistent handling of damage and player death, and some bewildering design choices at the end of the game, it's near impossible to recommend this game to anyone except for perhaps the most devoted of Trollhunters fans. I take no pleasure in commenting on a game this way, especially when developer WayForward's reputation far exceeds the output seen here. Defenders of Arcadia feels like a mobile IP tie-in, and that's simply a shame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this review, please check out our other videos, reviews, and previews, and be sure to subscribe to support us. For everything else Nintendo Switch, keep it here at SwitchJoy.
Keep an eye out for my stuff. It's there someplace.
I will.